Okay, so in this video what we're going to do is similar in a way to demand, but very, very different in another way. What we're going to talk about is how the supply of a particular good is affected by the prices of related goods. Now, we're not talking about complements and substitutes here at all, right? We are talking about, well, we'll come to that in a second, but we are talking about goods that a change in their price can affect the supply of the good in question. Okay, that's what we're talking about now. So we're fitting everything in to the acronym STORES, which I hope it is an acronym, I'm not even sure. Okay, so we've got subsidies and taxes. A change in either subsidies and or taxes will cause a shift of the supply curve. A change in the level of technology will cause a shift in the supply curve. And now what we're saying is a change in other related goods prices will also cause a shift in the supply curve. So we've done the subsidies and taxes, the technology, and the other related goods prices. After this video, we'll be halfway through this list. Okay, so again, just to remind you what an outward shift of the supply curve actually is, it just means that at every price more is supplied, and it is known as an increase in supply. On the other hand, an inward shift of the supply curve simply means that at every price less is supplied, and this is known as a decrease in supply. Now, these are two definitions that we're going to have to get right, and then I shall deal with them individually, whether it's an increase or a decrease. Now, a competitive supply, the definition of this exists where products are produced by the same factors of production and so compete for these resources for their production. Okay, so they're just the same things, the same factors of production will make two different items. All right, and therefore think about it. So land, you could use it to grow barley or you could use it to grow wheat. So if I use it to grow wheat, that means there's less factors of production available to grow barley and vice versa. Now, that's competitive supply. What joint supply is, goods which are produced together or where the production of one good involves the production of another product. For example, as a byproduct of production. And the example that I will use here is when you produce petrol, which is gasoline from crude oil, you absolutely seemingly have to, I'm not an expert on this or a chemist, produce diesel as well. So an increase in the supply of gasoline for your car necessitates an increase in supply of diesel. Okay, now, which is for another car. Now, let's think about this. So we're talking about competitive supply. So let's go back again just to remind ourselves. When the same factors of production, right, can be used to produce two separate products or more, and therefore they compete for these products compete for these resources for their production. Now, think about this, and this is potentially the first time I've said it, but it is 100% true. One of the assumptions we make, at least about perfectly competitive firms or competitive firms that operate in competitive markets, which we're talking about now, is that they're profit maximizers. And as the factors of production have alternative uses, producers therefore have to decide what to produce. So imagine a producer that is currently producing, and I mean soccer balls for any Americans that are watching. Footballs, I'm talking about round football soccer balls. But they're producing soccer balls with this equipment. But just because a soccer ball is round and a basketball is round, that just kind of pretty much means it's relatively easy to switch between them, production of footballs or production of basketballs. Right? So what we're saying is that these factors of production can very easily be put to alternative uses. And if I'm using the machine to produce soccer balls, by definition, I'm not using it at the same time, at the very least, to produce basketballs. So if the price of basketballs rose, the producer may reduce the amount of footballs that they are producing and switch to producing basketballs. Because the one machine, you have to decide, are we going to make footballs with it or basketballs? I know we can do half and half, 3/4 and 1/4. I'm not disputing that. But at any one time you are producing footballs, at the same time you are not using that machine to produce basketballs and vice versa. So they are competing for use of that machine. They are competing for resources. So if the price of basketballs rose, at least relative to footballs, the supplier may actually say, do you know what, there's a lot more profit in producing basketballs, forget producing footballs, or at the very least devote more time of the machine to the production of basketballs and less to the production of soccer balls. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, what we are saying, and I haven't I'm trying to keep it simple. For whatever reason, which you do need the demand curve, but for whatever reason, all I'm saying is there has been a movement up the supply curve of basketballs. That means that the sellers are getting a higher price for every good that they sell. The law of supply states that the quantity supplied should increase. Now, what do we need to do with our competitive supply in order to increase the quantity supplied? Well, basically, we're just going to say, look, flip this. There's an inward shift. We're going to produce less footballs. Now, the price of footballs itself hadn't changed. It had stayed the same. But relative to basketball, every basketball's selling price, which is now increased, every single price of footballs is now relatively less. And I want you to see that yes, this movement could be caused by something else, which we'll talk about when it comes to market equilibrium. But what I am saying is that there has been an inward shift in the supply of footballs because the price of an other good, which was supply competitive, had increased. Now, I hope that makes sense, guys. I really, really do. There's an inward shift in the supply curve of footballs as a result of an upward movement on the supply of basketballs. I hope that makes sense. So this is the supply curve of footballs following a rise in the price of basketballs. And what we're saying here is that there is an inward shift in the supply curve of footballs. At every price, less is supplied, and this is known as a decrease in supply. On the other hand, what would happen to the supply curve of footballs if the price of basketballs fell? If the price of basketballs fell, the producer may increase the amount of footballs that they are producing and produce less basketballs. Okay, so again, we're trying to keep everything in mind here. So there has been a downward movement or a movement down the existing supply curve. And what we're saying now, I've gone too far. And what we're saying now is that they're saying, okay, the profit margin per good sold has been reduced on the supply of basketballs because of the downward movement. I will therefore, as a producer of both soccer balls and basketballs, I shall therefore reduce the quantity supplied of basketballs and devote more of my time to the production of footballs or soccer balls, even though its price has not changed. That would result in an outward supply in the supply curve of footballs. So a fall in the price of basketballs just means that the supply curve shifts outwards. And that means that at every price more is supplied. And the supply curve of what? The supply curve of footballs this is. The supply curve of soccer balls will shift outwards. Because relative to basketballs, ceteris paribus, the profit margin per good sold now is increased. And this is known as an increase in supply. Okay, now back to our definition. So we've done the idea of competitive supply. Now we're going to do the idea of joint supply. Goods which are produced together or where the production of one good involves the production of another product as a byproduct of production. Now, what I shall do is just kind of leave this up. Of course, you can pause this at any stage you want and read through it yourself. But if when one good is produced, another good is produced at the same time, these goods are said to be in joint supply. In the process of fractional distillation, crude oil is turned into many different compounds. Two of these are petrol and diesel. Therefore, when petrol is produced, so is diesel, and vice versa. So if there's an increase in the demand for petrol, petroleum, gasoline from my American friends, the amount of petrol produced would increase to meet this increase in demand. Okay, so what I am saying, and I know this is a terrible thing because I'm putting in the equilibrium market. When more petrol is produced, then more diesel is produced. These goods are in joint supply. So, market for petrol. There's been an increase in the demand for petrol. That has caused, even if we ignore that, okay, that doesn't bother me, even if we ignore that, that has caused the quantity supplied of petrol to increase. And therefore, because we are producing more petrol as a result of a movement, we're also, whether we want to or not, are increasing the amount of diesel that we're producing. Okay, so there's been, and which hasn't changed in price. I know this has changed, but that has changed following the increase in the supply. So therefore, there's an outward shift in the supply curve. Now, I don't want to get into going from P1 to P2, but this is true. There is an outward shift in the supply of diesel. On the other hand, if there is a decrease in demand for petrol, the amount of petrol produced would decrease to reflect this decrease in demand. So the demand curve for petrol has decreased. Okay, the price therefore of petrol has fallen. Therefore, there has been a reduction in the quantity supplied, a movement from here to here along the existing quantity supplied. And that would cause less petrol to be produced, which in turn would mean that less diesel could possibly be produced, because we have to produce them both together if we're going to produce one. And this is the idea of joint supply. Now, once this happens, an intelligent person could realize that, well, there's an inward shift in the supply curve and that would cause the price to rise. Okay, and then what would they do with the price rise? Well, you see, other things could happen, but I'll leave it there for the moment. I won't go into it, all right, because this is as far as we need to go. Now, guys, that is competitive supply and joint supply. I know it's probably somewhat of a long video. I hope that makes sense. All I'm saying to you is if the price of another good that the firm can produce changes, depending on whether it's competitive or joint supply, that is going to have an alteration, a shift on the supply curve for this good in question. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I really hope this helped, and I very much look forward to seeing you in the next video.